Hey everybody, it's another majestic INFJ with a new video here. This is in response to a comment that somebody left asking if I could make videos on, the different cognitive functions and how they map onto different brain areas. Or another way of putting it, what brain areas are underlying the various cognitive functions are responsible for them. This is really just sort of a prologue to that. I would like to put some videos together where I go in depth and talk about the various brain structures and how this system is probably underlying TI, this system is probably underlying TE, that kind of thing. But I do want to do a little bit of looking into it some more. By way of quick background, 20 so years ago, I was in undergrad and then grad school for cognitive neuroscience. And then I sort of got an opportunity to do some legal research and then just ended up going to law school and been a lawyer ever since. And so I really only say that because a lot of what I know about the cognitive neuroscience area is probably pretty old. And I want to look into it and see if there's been any changes with respect to, what different brain areas are doing, different systems like that. So before I put those videos together, I want to do a little bit of looking into it. But that being said, one quick note, if you are interested in how MBTI maps onto the brain, if you haven't already checked out his research, you probably want to look into Dario Nardi, last name Nardi, and he was with UCLA. I'm not sure if he's still there or not, but he has very interesting work out there. He's very involved in the community. You can find a lot of videos and interviews with him where he explains some of his research. Now, he does mostly EEG work where they sort of put electrodes on your scalp and measure what part of the brain is active during various tasks. And a few of the interesting things that he's found, from what I remember, is people with a dominant judging function, so thinking or feeling, are going to have more activity associated with their left frontal lobe. And then on the flip side, people who have a dominant perception function, so intuition or sensing, and it's whether you're extroverted or introverted, doesn't matter, they're going to have more activity in their right frontal lobe. And that makes sense because your left frontal lobe is typically involved with what they call the executive function, so sort of figuring out what to do, and sort of planning, that kind of stuff. And so it would make sense that, extroverted thinking, extroverted feeling, which is very goal-oriented, plan-oriented behavior, would be in the left frontal lobe, where the right frontal lobe is more involved with sort of scoping out the landscape, sort of getting the big picture, figuring out what to pay attention to, what not to pay attention to. Lots of things like that. That's more sort of, it's less discrete and more sort of gestalt, is one way they put it. And you could see why that would be associated with more of a dominant perception function, where you're sort of figuring out what information out there is relevant, or what information to be using. So that's real interesting stuff. I know he's got a few books out there I'd recommend. It's been a while since I've looked into it. He also has some findings where introverted types tend to have more activity going on in the back of their brain, where extroverted types tend to have more activity going on in the front of the brain. Of course, we have activity, all of us have activity going on everywhere. This is all just sort of relative to each other. And again, that would make sense because the brain is basically, the information comes in, gets sent to the back of the brain, and then sort of moves forward through different pathways. And as the information moves forward, you're sort of doing your processing and your internal calculating. And then the front of the brain is basically deciding what to do with all that information, and how to order it, or how to use it in some sort of cohesive way, or generate speech, all that kind of stuff, generate movement, is all sort of controlled in the front part of the brain. And so if you sort of think of it, introverted versus extroverted, people will describe it as extroverted people tend to act before they think. I think that's probably overstating it. I think probably the better way is to say that they think about it, but they're more likely to act before an introverted person is. An introverted person is probably going to do a little bit more processing, and a little bit more, sort of observing, processing, just sort of internal calculations before they decide what they're going to do with all that information. And so, it makes sense. And it's one of the reasons that I actually give some credence, or, find some sort of comfort in the cognitive functions or the MBTI, because there's at least some empirical brain data that maps onto it pretty well. Hopefully this has all been replicated and and is withstanding scrutiny and all that. But, assuming that, these are valid results, I think they paint a pretty good picture. So definitely check out his stuff. If you're interested in, personality types and what different areas of the brain are doing to contribute to them. And again, I'm going to try to put together a series of videos that gets a little bit more in depth for each function, but I want to see what's out there. A couple of things I want to point out. First of all, it is kind of hard to find research, brain research, tied to the MBTI. And there's a few reasons for it that are worth noting. Number one, the MBTI is, the inventory is actually owned by the MBTI, or Myers-Briggs Corporation, whatever they call themselves. So they own all the intellectual property to, the inventory and probably the type descriptions and all of that. And they tend to do all their research, from my understanding, in-house, and keep it pretty close to the vest. They don't really lend it out to, the general researchers out there in academia doing this type of research. I think Nardi is an exception, because I think he was a practitioner, or is a MBTI practitioner. And so he's got a lot more of the background of the MBTI, and I don't know, he might have worked something out with them to where they're okay with him using MBTI stuff or, terminology and the inventory and all that for his research. I don't really know the background, but there's probably something there. But from what I could tell, and I did a little poking around today, but not a whole lot, but it doesn't seem like there's a whole lot of other people out there using the MBTI or the young cognitive functions as sort of the basis for their research, in trying to figure out what parts of the brain are underlying the different functions. But if you are aware of any, outside of what Nardi's doing, certainly let me know. I'd really be interested in looking at it. Another reason you don't see a whole lot of MBTI research in academia is because the personality researchers, at the various colleges and universities in academia, they tend to use the Oceans model, or otherwise known as the Big Five trait test. And that's, like if you ever watch Jordan Peterson, he's always talking about, the Big Five or the Oceans model. And that's the, how you score on openness, conscientiousness, extroversion, agreeableness, and neuroticism. And the academic world has pretty much settled on that as being sort of the way of measuring different personality types. And a lot of it's just because there's a very rich background. They've been using it for years. They've retested it and tested it. And, multiple people have done it and looked at it. And it tends to, withstand scrutiny. And not only that, but it's more of so instead of sort of giving you an inventory and then saying you're, an INFJ or you're an ESTJ or you're some sort of discrete type, they really just say, you score high on the various traits. And so it's basically, between 0 and 100, and it's a sliding scale. So you might be at 35% or 75%. So you're either high in openness or low in openness, or, right in the middle. And that is important because when you do statistics, for peer-reviewed journals and release studies, you've got to use particular types of measurements, what they call continuous variables for a lot of statistic models. And so it helps when you're using a variable that's like you're either at 0% or 100% or somewhere in between, as opposed to using discrete buckets like INFJ, ISTJ, ESTJ, that kind of thing. And it just has to do with the way that statistics works, and which we don't have to get into. But I just wanted to point out that that's another reason that they tend to use the Oceans model, just because it's easier to do the stats with. And then, there's also just sort of the general sort of practical issue that, the MBTI is loosely based off of Jung. And, people in academia research field, they don't really tend to buy into Jung a whole lot. They'll look to him for some of his interesting thoughts and observations that he made along the way. You'll see them sort of cite him every once in a while, but you have to keep in mind Jung was he was a psychoanalyst. He wasn't out there doing empirical research. He just wrote based off of his observations. And so in a way, he was a little bit more of a philosopher than an empirical psychologist. And, in the social sciences, they want something that's more empirical, stats driven. And Jung just, he doesn't really provide that. And for whatever reason, that makes them sort of ignore a lot of his contributions, at least in the empirical world. And, you sort of couple that with all the mysticism and everything that he was into. For a while, people just sort of distanced themselves from him because they wanted to be seen as like real scientists doing real empirical research. So because of all those reasons, you're not going to see a whole lot of MBTI research where they're sort of mapping brain areas to different cognitive functions. Other than the stuff out there from Nardi. But, again, if there's other people out there doing it, please let me know. I'd love to look into what they're doing. Okay, so So again, most of the sort of mapping the brain to different personality traits is more likely going to be done under an Ocean's model, which sort of maps onto the cognitive functions, but not really one to one. You could think of openness as, that's your openness to new ideas, and you could think of that as being sort of high on intuition if you're high on openness, or conscientiousness where you're sort of detail oriented and you're very good at following instructions. That could be tied to TE, or maybe FE, um, you know, and things like that. But it doesn't really map on one to one, so it's sort of hard to make analogies between the two. Um, okay, and the other thing I wanted to sort of discuss was the person who left the comment uh, asked whether or not I discuss the different cognitive functions and how they relate to neurodivergent behaviors such as autism or ADHD. Um, and I want to say a few things on that because there does tend to be this sort of, you know, um, general impression out there that different personality types are more likely to be autistic, or put it another way around, if somebody is autistic, they're more likely to have such and such personality type. There may be something to it. I know they've done studies with autism in the big five traits, and they tend to score high on neuroticism, and I think I forget the actual results, but they tend to score high on some of the traits and low on others, and it sort of makes sense. But that being said, I haven't really seen anything tying to MBTI, and I would be a little cautious about just sort of theorizing or coming up with your own theory outside of the empirical literature, because with ADHD and autism, it's a more wide they're more widespread issues, right? It's not just like one cognitive function is deficient and all the other ones are working just fine. It tends to be, with autism or ADHD, there's different elements and they tend to have difficulties in various domains. For example, with autism, the trait we typically think of, or the behavior we typically think of, is they have a hard time relating to people. They have a hard time making eye contact. They have a hard time reading faces, that kind of thing. And and you might come across or might come away from that and just think, oh well, that's probably they're probably FE polar. If you're not sure what I mean by polar, I have other videos on what the polar function is and what it means for the various types. But you might be thinking, okay, they're low on FE. They might be high in TE or TI. But if you sort of unpack it a little bit more, you'll see that they have other deficits in other types of tasks. For example, like, they have a hard time processing sort of the relationships between objects, like whether something's over an object or under an object, or how different words might have different meanings in different contexts, that kind of thing, or the same word has different meanings in different contexts. Just a lot of stuff that they've sort of discovered along the way that's more than just like the inability to sort of make social connections. So yeah, maybe having low FE might be part of it, but it's not going to explain the whole thing, because there's a lot of other behaviors that would be tied to other cognitive functions that you would see issues with. So I don't think it's as simple as just saying they're low on FE and everything else is fine, or everything else sort of stacks up the same way it does with the neurotypical types. Same thing for ADHD. When I was in undergrad and first starting, ADHD was just sort of seen as like hyperactivity, right? Just kids that couldn't sit still and had a lot of energy and needed to move around and do different things all the time. And hyperactivity is certainly still part of it, but the more that they do the research, they see that they have issues with attentional focus, right? So there's a part of the brain that sort of shines your attentional spotlight on on whatever task you're doing. Like if I give you a math problem, or if I give you a paragraph to read or something like that, you've got to focus the part of your brain that processes that kind of stuff, and stay focused on it. And then there's a disengagement part of the brain or system within the brain that takes your attention away from that task to whatever the new thing is, right? And so they have this, people with ADHD tend to have a problem with disengaging attention too quickly, right? Like their disengagement system sort of kicks in too early or something like that. And so they tend to shift attention all over the place. Or impulse control, where if you put somebody with ADHD in front of a computer and say, hey, don't touch anything, and you leave the room, they might start poking at the keys or poking at the computer or something. Just sort of having this difficulty controlling their impulses. And that is something you will also see with people with damage to the frontal lobe, executive control type stuff. So the point being is that the people with ADHD and people with autism tend to show deficits in a lot of different functions, and it's not just one. So it's very hard to just say, look, they've got a problem with FE, and so they're more likely an INTJ or an ISTJ or INTP or something like that. I could see the natural tendency of doing that, but I don't think it explains everything. Same with ADHD. You could think of them as having, instead of a deficit in something, maybe they've supercharged SE or supercharged NE, that frontal lobe type stuff. And maybe, but, it doesn't necessarily mean they're going to be an SE type over an NE type, right? You might have, a lot of ENFPs that have dominant extroverted intuition, or you might have a lot of people with ADHD that are ESFPs that have a lot of dominant SE, right? So, you'd have to sort of look at it in sort of broader strokes, I guess. And again, with autism and ADHD, to me, it's less about them having an issue with any particular function. It's more about the coordination of the functions. It's, for the neurotypical types out there, our functions are sort of working in harmony. They're working in concert together, right? And and I would argue that the differences in personality is that each one of us has a little bit of an imbalance in that, where we have one function that's sort of being ignored while other functions are sort of overcompensating for it. Watch all my domain shifting and polar videos for more on that. But your personality type is sort of all of those different functions working together in some sort of bigger whole, right? And the different types map on to how the different functions coordinate with each other, right? Does one sort of is one function louder than the other functions in sort of the attentional framework? Where ADHD, autism, and then other personality disorders, bipolar disorder, borderline personality disorder, narcissism, antisocial behavior, all that kind of stuff. That tends to be more of, different areas just have a hard time talking to each other and coordinating. And what you'll see is that, that the brain areas responsible for doing the cognitive function seem to be okay. It's the connections between them that have the issue. So, for example, and I saw this guy give a talk on YouTube or something not too long ago. I have no idea, how valid this research is, but it made sense to me, and he seemed to be a professional. But his argument about ADHD is that there's a breakdown between what's going on in the back of the head versus in what's going on in the front of the head, where they're just not talking to each other. And if you actually look at the biology of people with ADHD, there's a big cluster of myelin or fibers that connects the back of your brain to the front of the brain. And they tend to have a basically a lower count, right? It's not as big as what you'll see in neurotypical folks, and so there might be something to that, right? Where they just have a hard time. They know what they're supposed to do, but they have a hard time figuring out how to actually do it, right? Or maybe a better way of saying it is they know what they're supposed to be doing. They just have a hard time doing it, right? And that might be an SE issue. That might be an NE issue. Might be a TE issue. Might be an FE issue, right? There's something about the front of their brain having difficulty talking to the back of their brain. And I don't know if that necessarily lends itself to being more likely being one type versus the other, right? It could just be, you are whatever type you would have been without the ADHD, but the ADHD just sort of makes you more of that type, I guess, or just sort of accentuates, part of it. So, for example, if you're an ENFP and you have ADHD, even if you didn't have the ADHD, you'd probably be an ENFP. But coupling the ENFP with the ADHD, you just see, more activity going on in that right frontal lobe where, they're engaging that extroverted intuition maybe more than another ENFP might. Or they're engaging that, or an ESFP might be engaging their SE a little bit more than other types might. And again, it just might be because the two parts of the brain aren't talking to each other. Because because another thing to keep in mind when you're talking about brain systems is a lot of times what different areas of the brain are doing is sometimes they're turning each other on and sometimes they're turning each other off, or they're inhibiting activity in the other part of the brain so that they can focus on the task at hand and use the part of the brain that's necessary for that task and shut down everything else. And ADHD might just be, having difficulty where the front part of the brain is trying to tell the back part of the brain, shut up, shut up, shut up. And the back part of the brain just isn't getting that signal strong enough and just keeps going. Or it could be the vice versa, where the back part of the brain is, just keeps going, and it's having a hard time telling the front part of the brain, okay, now here's what to do with all this information. So that's sort of a long way of saying that, with autism, with ADHD, with, narcissism, borderline personality disorder, all that kind of stuff tends to be, again, systems just not talking to each other, as opposed to other types of patients where they have more discrete cortical damage, right? So if somebody has damage to the occipital lobe, they're going to be blind, right? Or might not be able to see a, you know, in a particular field of vision, an area in their field of vision, or they might not be able to see different types of colors or different types of shapes, round shapes versus square shapes, things like that. Or somebody who has damage in the Broca's area, which is in the frontal cortex, they have difficulty producing language, right? But in both those cases, it's a very discrete deficit, right? They can do all the other stuff, right? So somebody with damage to Broca's area, they can do math, they can, follow instructions, they have, good social skills, all that kind of stuff. They just have a hard time producing language, right? So it's a very, very discrete, localized deficit. Same with damage to the occipital lobe. They could have a very discrete deficit that just has to do with visual processing, but they can do all other sorts of things. Do math problems, follow instructions, all that kind of stuff. Where ADHD and autism, it's more widespread. You're going to see deficits in different types of cognitive tasks, not just one localized area. And when you see that, again, it's more likely just the different parts of the brain are having difficulty talking to each other. Not so much that, they have a deficit in a particular module, like, not being able to see or something like that, something very discrete. It's sort of a combination. And again, if you think of your brain as sort of this orchestra of all this different activity and all this different types of cognitive processing, that has to be a well-tuned orchestra, right? They have to play in tune. They have to, some have to be loud, some have to be quiet, and and it's a very dynamic, fluid system. And if the various modules aren't talking to each other and working together, then you'll see sort of a breakdown in the way that you see with autism, ADHD. So because of that, I think you can make loose associations with the various types. But I don't think you can really say definitively that, if somebody has autism, then they are most likely going to be an INTP or an INTJ. I get it. I can see why people might think that. But if you're just looking at it from the cognitive function perspective, I don't think you can necessarily get there, right? I don't think you can necessarily derive those particular conclusions. So that's really about it. Like I said before, I do plan on talking about the different brain areas and how they map onto the cognitive functions, but I just want to sort of refresh my memory and catch up on anything else that might be out there that people have discovered in the last 20 years or so. And again, if anybody out there is aware of research that specifically uses cognitive functions or MBTI types and draws some sort of connection to the brain, different brain areas, certainly let me know. I'm aware, like I said, I'm aware of the stuff that Nardi's done and stuff that's come out of his lab. But if there's others out there doing it, I'd certainly be interested in looking at it. Okay, thanks, and I'll see you next time.